and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andris Sprūds. I am director of Latvian Institute of International Affairs and professor at Rigas Lejiņš University. And of course, I have always the pleasure to welcome all of you in such a large numbers in one of our discussions on, I think, very topical issues on the Baltic Sea region and hard and soft security reconsidered. I would not go too much into the details because we will have a lot of good discussions today and also keynote speech by Atis Lejiņš. Just couple of, you can say, signals or elements when we speak about Baltic Sea region. Last year, Warsaw NATO summit, very important for us, commitment about deploying the troops here in the Baltic countries and in Poland. But at the same time, we see that we have one battalion in each country, while Russia, as a reaction, have one division next to almost each country. So we see that this dangerous brinkmanship and some tensions certainly remain in the region. Infrastructure, we are very much interconnected in many ways, regionally, in terms of energy infrastructure, in terms of transportation infrastructure, but also we see here some controversial issues. Nord Stream 2, regional countries participate in this idea of bringing Nord Stream 2 on agenda, on fruition, but of course some countries are not very happy about this. Societal resilience. Here in Latvia, in one of the articles we can read the more than 60% of our society is not very trustful of our public institutions. So it means that, of course, also in terms of societal cohesion, in terms of trust, we have some challenges here to address, to face. So the region has a multidimensional, multi-layer issues, aspects, you can say, challenges. At the same time, region has been one of the regions of stability, one of the regions of growth, and potential here remains even to develop this growth further, to interact more, to engage more, including with our neighbor of Russia. It is our neighbor, and in terms of trade, still quite very important, and not only just in trade, a partner. Today's discussion, we will address those hard and soft security issues. We will address the challenges what exist. We try to identify some trajectories, how it looks from the region, how it looks also from outside. These are important elements. And of course, I encourage everybody to participate actively in this discussion. So the event will be divided in two parts. We start with a panel on hard security, and then we proceed to so-called soft security, which of course is very inclusive, very embracing subject, and we will touch upon some of the aspects. This event would be impossible without good partnerships, as usually. So the region is network of partners and partnerships, and also this event is example of this. We have good partnership with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. I always like to underline it, and it is very important partner for us. We have also very good partnership with NATO. So also the NATO is on board, and we are thankful for supporting and participating in a debate. Also, we have a good partnership with Nordic Council of Ministers. Unfortunately, I must say that we have sad news here that Jan Wittberg was the head of the Nordic Council office, was supposed to be here, but unfortunately and sadly he passed away. So things happen, and it seems that we see that sometimes positive and ambitious dynamic might come to halt, unfortunately. But anyhow, let's proceed, and I am happy to give the floor to Atis Lejiņš, who is a member of the parliament, but more importantly, he has been and he is, not just has been, but he is a founder of Latvian Institute of International Affairs already almost for 25 years, and Atis is also honorary director, and of course, Institute as a platform for a discussion, for regional debate and engagement has been established by Atis, and we are very honored and delighted to have Atis on board today and to give some keynote address, some introductory remarks for setting the tone for the whole discussion. Atis Lejiņš, the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Andris. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a miracle has happened. In the 1920s, when the Baltic states broke away from the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, one of the main foreign policy and defense goals was what? To forge a military alliance between not just the 3 Baltic states, but also the 4th Baltic state, Finland, and maybe also Poland. So you had 5 states on which the Latvian Foreign Ministry worked on. Our first foreign minister, Mr. Sigrid Merovits. Of course, nothing came of that, except for a small military alliance between Estonia and Latvia. Today you look at the Baltic Sea region, actually there should be a map, and you can say we have just about, is there a map? Well, yeah, well. We just about have a military alliance, not just between Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, but also Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. It's not an alliance, of course, but you can look at the events leading to what I call an alliance almost, and they are all very logical. Can you imagine even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that there would be a host nation support agreement with NATO in Sweden? You would be very risky to make such a prognosis. And even with Finland, even 2 years ago, could you imagine Americans training with the Finnish army in Finland on Finnish soil? Just last month, there was an American amphibious assault just 100 kilometers southeast of Helsinki, where the Americans in fast amphibious boats landed on the coast of Finland and together with Finnish armed forces beat back the invader. And fighter airplanes are involved. Norway, NATO is allowed to bomb Sweden, you know. So, and of course, you know what is happening in the Baltic states, you know what is happening in Poland. Andris has already mentioned, you read about this in newspapers. So am I right, I would like to ask the panelists, that the Baltic dream of forging a military association, entente or alliance in the 20s has come to pass? And who do we have to thank for that? These countries? Or do we thank Putin for that? This is a question. Because I have mentioned in the Latvian press, you know, that Putin has made his biggest strategic mistake in pulling all these countries together and getting America involved. Because without America, it's obvious, none of this would have happened, because we're all too scared, you know, right? We can't fight. Although, I would make a proposition to the panelists again, another one. If because of, well, the American election, we heard some strange comments about Crimea, Ukraine, and NATO, and so on. If there was a beginning of a lack of interest in America in this region, wouldn't it be good on the part of all these countries to build up an even stronger military posture, because that would convince America you can't ignore this region because they're next to Russia, right? And that's a big power, and America needs to, you know, work with this. You know, they have their national interests and Russian interests, and they cannot let go of the Baltic states because we are strong together, extremely strong. You put all the armies and the air forces together, it comes to something. It's much bigger than the NATO presence now in the Baltic states. And I might as well tell you, you know, that if you attended the Riga conference, and this is another question to you panelists, the third one I think, was that we were surprised to hear, we didn't know this actually, we know that Swedish planes land and take off from Lielvard military airport, but we didn't know that actually Sweden had offered its military planes to patrol the Baltic air skies. Did you know that? And Latvia said no, because Sweden is not in the NATO chain of command. I want to even ask you the question when they will join NATO. That's irrelevant actually now, because they are in NATO. They're much better NATO countries than some NATO countries that are already in. So, but my main point is that this has become a hard security area, and it is a triumph of Baltic foreign policy and security policy. Thank you very much.
Atis, thank you so much. even though you are in the parliament, and of course we appreciate also your support and our cooperation between the think tanks and legislative body, at the same time we can feel that you still have this spirit of researcher, spirit of think tank representative, sort of providing the food for thought. And I think, of course, there was already quite a number of food for thought to elaborate on our panels. And of course, you also depicted quite a optimistic picture of where we go in the region. Being a little bit more skeptical on some things and discussing with my students, we have this humor when Estonians ask to Latvians to lend tanks for exercises. Latvians ask, so how many tanks you would like to have, both, one or both? So of course there are also some limits of, you can say, military strength here in the region. So let's not perhaps overblow out of portions the strength what it is here. And I think it is important to discuss also these issues, how defensible we are, and I hope this will be discussed. As I said previously, we will have the two panels. One will be for 1 hour a little bit more on security, on hard security, and second one will be more on soft security. And with this, I am glad to finish this introductory part and give the floor to Ilvija Brudi, who is Research Fellow of Latvian Institute of International Affairs, also one of the editors of the book. So Ilvija, the floor is yours to take it over and already to proceed with dynamic discussion. Ilvija, please.
Thank you, Andris. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Before the panelists answer your questions, Mr. Lejiņš, I would like to introduce them. So the first speaker that we have here is Gabriel Bernier, who is the head of defense policy section of NATO headquarters. Then we have Wojciech Lawrence from, I hope I spelled it correctly. He's a senior research fellow at the Polish Institute of International Relations, and he's engaged in international security and defense industry analysis. His research includes also NATO, Polish security, and cybersecurity. Then we have Henrik Praks from Estonia, who is a research fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security. And again, his research focuses on NATO collective defense, on EU security cooperation, and Henrik is also a lecturer in the Baltic Defense College in Tartu. And we have the fourth speaker, which is Mika Aaltola from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, but unfortunately his flight is a little bit delayed, so he's going to join us in hopefully about 10 to 20 minutes in time for his speech. So I would like to start this discussion with you, Mr. Gabriel Bernier, and besides the questions that were already asked by Mr. Lejiņš, I would also like to ask you maybe a similar question. Do you think that the decisions made in Warsaw Summit will be enough to assure this region that they are safe and that NATO is going to help it? Just a speculation on that, maybe. The floor is yours. You have about 7 minutes for the first intervention.
Thank you all for this invitation. It's great being here. In terms of this issue, I mean, this is spot on. We've been working on the issue of Baltic Sea security for some time, using different angles of approach. Of course, the first angle is request by nations, like major issue to be looked at, implications for NATO, implications for nations, and what should we do in terms of defense policy. Let me just start by saying that NATO is a defensive alliance. It is a multilateral organization, meaning nations decide. So the things I will mention were decided by allies. It tells you about the strength of the decisions that were taken. So this is an important issue. It's an issue, security in the Baltic region, that was a driver for decisions, including at Warsaw. So the timeliness of this book is perfect. Second message from my side, the overall security context. East, South, you've heard that in the press, you read this every day. From our perspective, the Baltic Sea security fits into a wider context within the notion of instability we are faced with. It is also the rediscovery of geography. most people have forgotten that there is a Baltic Sea, a Black Sea, a Mediterranean, even the North Atlantic. It's written on the building where I work, but most people have forgotten that. So it is the return of geography. From the way I see it, the Baltic Sea is the area of the world where NATO, the European Union, and Russia intersect. So the fact that you're looking at soft and hard security is very apt. Why? Because we have defense issues, defense and security issues, but we have also trade issues, energy issues, a whole bunch of things which are multi-layered, some very positive, some rather negative. And we have to sort this out. So I will look at only the defense issue, because that's what I have to deal with. The element which is important also is that looking from a Russia angle, the Kaliningrad Oblast, of course, is a key element and has to be mentioned because it is an area for influence. It is an area used for intelligence gathering. It is an area used for training and exercising. It is also, from a defense perspective, from the Russian perspective, their own forward defense of their northern fleet, which is the home of their deterrence policy. So it's very important for them. So they also are faced with a number of things. So all these issues intersect. Third element, important for me, is that the key parameter, of course, from where I sit, is Russian foreign and defense policy, because that's a driver. Elements of concern, of course, the force posture. Element of concern, the power structure, the thinking along the lines of sphere of influence, which is something which is not, which we cannot relate to. The notion of the use of force, the notion of ambiguity. And these two elements are important because we've seen them played out during the Crimea crisis. What we see, and that's my fourth message, the challenge in this area is the notion of instability, of unpredictability, and therefore of risk from a defense perspective. So it is on these elements that we have worked on in order to increase our security. I do not have an issue with Russian forces on Russian sovereign territory. That's not a problem from a NATO perspective. The problem for our NATO perspective is the buildup of forces with the potential for offensive application towards NATO territory in the context of destabilizing behavior. These elements together are a problem for us. You may have heard of the A2AD formulation, anti-access area denial. These are defensive capabilities, long-range anti-aircraft, anti-ship missiles. Per se, they're not a problem. Put together, in aggregate, they represent a potential reach into Allied territory. So this is something that we look at because they offer, if they're used in the wrong way, the potential for coercion, for threats, for infringement. And this is something we try to avoid. Fifth message, NATO response. This is the heart of the decisions that were taken first at the Warsaw Summit, and initially at Wales. If you recall the Wales Summit in 2014, it was a reactive summit. Reactive in terms of what are the implications of the Crimea crisis. Reactive in terms of what are the implications of ISIL Daesh. So we started to work on those elements. And nations decided at that time, at heads of state and government level, the readiness action plan, to work on the readiness of our forces, to work on where they are, to work on the decision-making process, and to work on the notion of reinforcement. This is why we strengthened the NATO response force. Fast forward 2016, July, the Warsaw Summit. We went from thinking about the implications of hybrid warfare to the implications of anti-access area denial. Therefore, the impossibility or the difficulty NATO would have in the case of a problem in this area, for instance, of reinforcing because of the defensive capabilities. We looked at a number of things, and the grand total is the strengthening of NATO's deterrence and defense posture. And you have two elements. To really understand the Warsaw Summit, there are two elements. The first part, one side of the coin, is the deterrence and defense posture. How do we defend ourselves? The second side of the coin is what the Secretary General calls projecting stability. The grand total, the real name, the full title is NATO's contribution to the efforts of the international community in projecting stability. How do we help outside of our borders? And this is very important. Just to deal with that very quickly, it is the combination of what we call defense capacity building with the rest of the world called security sector reform. How do we help nations, how do we help partners build up their defense administration, their force structure that makes sense, that they can defend themselves? The second element is the partnership policy, to put it in a coherent fashion. And the third element is our crisis response operation capability. So this whole package is projecting stability. What interests me for today is the deterrence and defense posture. So here there are a number of elements. I will not go through all of them because I will eat through my time. But of course, the most political visible, especially here, and the most significant symbolically and with a military element which is important is enhanced forward presence. I mean, it is modest. And I have to put up front a disclaimer here. The decisions we have taken, the decisions NATO have taken, they are strictly defensive. They are proportionate. They respect fully our international commitments. And they're sustainable. And that's the beauty of it. So enhanced forward presence is framework nations in the Baltic 3 and Poland with contributing nations providing advanced forces, forward presence. The interesting element is that it is a way to show, to demonstrate solidarity, determination, and the ability to act militarily. It is battalion-sized battle groups. It is very modest. It symbolizes and it has the function of a tripwire in case any contingency would happen in this area of the world. So this it was complicated to put together. It was complicated to calibrate, but it was a very significant decision taken by heads of state and government. There was basically a game changer as regards security in Europe. Other decisions were taken, of course, tailored forward presence, which is the elements of presence that are being worked out currently as regard the southeast of the alliance. That's Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. So a land element is already in place, and there are discussions about the strengthening of the maritime and the air component. I've got 1 minute left, so I'll go very quickly. We've got elements for the south. What's the south agenda? How do we deal with elements from the south? We have improved capabilities, forces and capabilities, basically readiness, force readiness, and being heavy and faster. Heavy, this is the return of armor. The importance of nuclear deterrence. If you do, maybe I have 30 seconds left. If you do a very fast word check in the Warsaw Summit communique, you will find 28 reference to the notion of nuclear deterrence. In the Washington communique, 99-1. So it tells you about the cultural shift which has happened. Last element, if I may, defense investment pledge, as important as ever. No money, no security. It's as simple as that. And one last element, very important, strengthening of deterrence and defense has incorporated into it the notion of dialogue with Russia, meaningful dialogue, and transparency. This is something which, is part of my portfolio. We engage on that very strongly. We had NRC right after the Warsaw Summit where we presented our posture. And this is something we keep pushing even though we are facing very strong headwinds. I very last. Importance of engaging with others. Sir, you mentioned Finland and Sweden. They are very, very, very close partners to us. We work a lot together, of course, on Baltic Sea security and other issues also, and the importance of the European Union. You may have noted that at the margins of the Warsaw Summit, there was a joint declaration signed by Secretary General of NATO, President of the European Council, President of the Commission, very forceful. We are working on the implementation of that. So, my concluding remark, if I may? Strengthening NATO deterrence and defense directly contributes to strengthening security in the Baltic Sea region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bernier. It was very interesting, so I didn't want to interrupt you, but and thank you for a very, very informative speech as well. We will now hear the opinion from the strongest of the, probably one of the strongest regions powers in NATO, from Poland. So, Mr. Lawrence, what is the Warsaw's view on Warsaw's decisions?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for your presence here. I will start with a brief risk assessment, if I may, so it will give you a better picture where we are now and what is the significance of the decisions taken in Warsaw. First of all, it is very important to define who is defending the status quo in the region, because this is usually the area which causes the biggest problems, and we could see this, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it put the world on the brink of the war. Russia believes that the status quo after the collapse of the USSR should be based on the Old West, Russia, and the buffer zone in between. And they communicated it very clearly from the very beginning that they perceive NATO enlargement as the threat. It also perceives once NATO enlarged, it takes this one-sided political commitment that NATO will not deploy any significant military forces to the region permanently or installations. It also perceives this as a part of this status quo, even if it was unable to block NATO enlargement. From Western perspective, the status quo is based on the rule-based order, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the freedom of countries, freedom of choice of what alliances they want to choose. And all the countries, Russia as well, subscribed to this in Helsinki Final Act and also in other international agreements. So we also have the right to say that, okay, we are defending the status quo. And from our perspective, from the Western perspective, it is also important that values are at play. And you will find it in international relations theory that values for some countries may be so important that they are ready to die for them. And of course, we also theoretically know that what we perceive as defensive, as Mr. Bernier said, that NATO is a defensive alliance, and this is the fact. But we know from the history that what one side perceives is defensive, the other side perceives as a threat to itself. And Thucydides, Greek historian, wrote about this 500 years before Christ. So what is happening now? Russia is trying to enforce the solution which would guarantee that the status quo, as she perceives it, will be followed. And there are two levels at play. Status of the post-Soviet space, and Russia, by using military force in Georgia and Ukraine, has already put it into the de facto a gray zone of security. We officially, because we are sticking to our values in NATO, we maintain the open door policy, but it would be fair to say that there wouldn't be a consensus in the foreseeable future to enlarge NATO to further to the post-Soviet space, because those countries would be indefensible, first of all. And obviously, it would have a serious repercussions for the credibility of NATO. But Russia may be not happy with this de facto sphere of influence. It would probably like to have a legally binding assurances. And we can see that this is what Russia tries to achieve in Ukraine, that it wants to have the constitutional order in Ukraine that would actually wouldn't allow Ukraine to join NATO or even EU in the future. And there is another level at play, because during the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact countries offered Russia, Soviet Union, a buffer zone, and it was pretty important for strategic reasons. And with the collapse of the USSR and former Warsaw Pact countries joining NATO, Russia lost this part of the strategic depth. And so it is pretty important from the military point of view for Russia to maintain this buffer on our region. Again, she may be happy with one-sided political commitment that NATO took, but we cannot exclude that Russia would try to enforce the political solution that would put also those countries, the border states of NATO, also of the EU, like Sweden and Finland, into the gray zone of security. So we now see that Russia employs these tactics of coercive bargaining, that by escalating tensions with the West, deploying all those assets close to the borders, carrying out huge snap exercises that we are unable to react to because they are mobilizing 50 or 80,000 troops within days, and NATO would be unable to move troops that quickly to the region. It demonstrates clearly that it has regional military superiority that it could be exploited for Russia's benefit. So this is not only muscle flexing as media presented, this raises costs for the West, for NATO, for border states. We need to invest in capabilities, we need to switch NATO to the new defense posture. It is a very long and very, very, very expensive process. So Russia may calculate that sooner or later the West will get tired and will start to negotiate the new deal, the new security architecture. But we cannot exclude, unfortunately, also the black case scenario. And this is the scenario where Russia could calculate that it is the strategic benefit from exploiting this regional superiority and taking a part of NATO territory and treat it as a bargaining chip, and enforce the political negotiations and to get the legally binding assurances that there will be no NATO enlargement, no EU enlargement, and no NATO troops here in the region, that then they may calculate that it is worth all those costs that we are trying to raise to Russia as well by investing in military capabilities in the region and demonstrating that NATO is strong, coherent, and will react to this kind of scenario. So the decisions taken during the NATO Warsaw Summit actually moved NATO from reassurance, from the decisions that were focused on reassuring the allies that NATO is credible and strong, to deterrence. Those combat battalions that will be deployed in Poland and the Baltic states, they send a clear signal that if Russia decides to use force, it will need to deal with the whole NATO, first of all, because these are multinational units, but with the strongest member states, because obviously I will not name the smallest countries which Russia is not afraid of, but definitely Russia is afraid of UK, Germany, US, and France, and all those countries that put their elements into those combat battalions. So hopefully it will influence the calculations of Putin. But obviously we need some strategy, and I'm not sure that we have it in NATO. There are different options that NATO can take now. Russia hopes that it will be the tactics or strategy of appeasement, and some bigger countries where we have new leadership will make the concessions at this point, which would be a suicidal, because we also know it from history and from theory as well, that it only encourages this player who has a stronger hand to ask for more concessions. Or we can persevere and wait for Russia to understand that we are not going to give up, and if Russia does not look for a face-saving solution, that actually those troops that are deployed here in the region will stay not for 2 or 3 years, but for 10 or 20. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. Now we should move to a smaller country. Estonia is one of the few who has a 2% budget for military already. You're maybe not as much affected by the statements of the president-elect of the U.S., but how does it feel in Estonia? Does it feel like the NATO Warsaw Summit decisions will stay intact, or will something change?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to contribute to this very interesting discussion. Okay, now you hear me better. I would start first with the overall issue, where are we with the deterrence, and then I'm going to also end up with some issues related to the ongoing changes in the world political, and including President-elect Trump. But if I speak about military security in the Baltic Sea area, basically everything we do here should be meant to deter Russia from undertaking aggressive actions. And deterrence basically has 2 pillars, which I would say a political component and a military component. Political component is a visible, clear resolve or political will to defend every ally jointly, and the military component is existence of capabilities which are recognizable to respond effectively to aggression, whatever form it would take. And these 2 are interlinked pillars, obviously, because without political will, there is not much use of military capabilities, but even if you don't have military capabilities, political will by itself is insufficient. So they should be credibly tied together. And it is clear also, I would say, that Russia's policy will not change. There is nothing at the moment in Kremlin's actions which would lead us to assume that Russia would be eager to change the course. It has self-selected West as an enemy and uses it also internally for the purposes of self-legitimation of a regime. So it's safe to assume that Russia would look to opportunities to test NATO, to look for vulnerabilities and weaknesses which it could exploit. Now on Warsaw results, and starting first with, let's say, military part of this deterrence pillar, I do agree that there is no doubt that Warsaw decisions by itself were historic. If you look from our corner, from the northeastern flank of NATO, our region was clearly a centerpiece of a summit, as has already been pointed out. And most visible result, the enhanced forward presence battalions, it is a first combat-capable allied presence in our countries. And the shift from assurance to deterrence has also been mentioned. But now is question, of course, that the decisions are one, but also you need to implement the decisions. So speedy and credible implementation of them is very important. The battalions will have to be military credible, because still, of course, they are small, modest, as pointed out, but they are meant to be combat capable. They are to function, first of all, as a tripwire, but they could also, by their capabilities, and if they are usable, I mean, they would have a C2 command and control arrangements and rules of engagement, which would enable them to be used in certain scenarios. They could also close off some, let's say, easier avenues for limited scenarios for Russia, which Russia might use. So it is very important that they are not just a political signaling, but they also have, let's say, some military punch. And there are also positive signals. In case of Estonia, both UK and France, which will be coming early next year, UK as a lead nation and France as another contributing nation, have publicly stated that they will be sending heavy forces, including tanks and heavy equipment to Estonia. And I hope the same will happen with our battalions also. And in this aspect, of course, important part, besides the enhanced forward presence, not part under NATO umbrella per se, but linked to that is the American presence in Eastern Europe, in the framework of ERI initiative. As we know from beginning of next year, American combat capabilities will also move to Eastern Europe with a brigade, armored brigade HQ being stationed in Poland, and the brigade somehow rotating around the region to be still seen how it works out, but we should not also forget that. And of course, the time will not allow to go into details on other military issues, but of course, these battalions, it is just one piece of overall NATO defense and deterrence puzzle, because as clearly pointed out, they are by itself insufficient to deter Russia from a full-scale military aggression. So the battalions have to be connected with wider NATO reaction cycle or reaction modus. I mean, how they are connected with enhanced NRF to a follow-on forces, to other elements, air, sea domain, etc., etc. So it's a lot of work for the militaries, obviously, but at least where the work is going on, we see. Now to a political part, and here obviously things are becoming trickier and trickier, or at least unpredictable and more unpredictable, because as said, deterrence basically starts with resolve and unity, and it is first of all like a conflict of wills, a psychological contest in many ways. So there is an extremely important that when messages NATO allies, leaders send out, that there is a consistency and clarity in that messages. We need messages like President Obama, the outgoing president, made in Tallinn 2014, when he clearly said that the defense of Tallinn, Riga, Vilnius, Warsaw, our capitals, is as important as the defense of Washington. We do not need messages like some American politicians, Newt Gingrich, who I understand now luckily will not be in the new administration, probably has said that, for example, Tallinn is basically a suburb of St. Petersburg, or like that. Or some other even allied foreign ministers before NATO summit saying, one minister saying that NATO should stop saber rattling on Russia's western border. Such messages are certainly not helpful. I'm not obviously original when I say that we are at the moment in the era of very much big uncertainty and unpredictability resulting from the American presidential elections. Obviously not only from that, but at the moment mainly from there. But at the same time, we should not fall into hysteria, because we don't know what is going. As some people have said, we should take Trump seriously, but not exactly literally what he has said, because he has already. He clearly does not know what he wants on those in these areas. He's just in the learning mode, and we can only hope that he can learn fast and learn right things. But we can of course not be sure. The appointments will be very important. There is still some faces are known, others are more still speculated. It will be probably a mixed bag of people, of a more, let's say, mainstream people, but also certain, let's say, unconventional people were in his stuff. So on the Russia issue, I think it would be safe to assume that some kind of opening to Russia will be made by the new administrations, and there will be bargaining, but hopefully the administration will learn from previous mistakes not to repeat. For example, the issue of the sanctions will be continued, because that's an area I understand president can almost by himself change in America. On many other things you need a congressional approval, but to let's say stop sanctions or part of the sanctions against Russia, that can president easily do. I think that will be clearly a litmus test in the early period of administration. And finally, before I finish, well, what should we do? I mean, it's a question in that context. I think for us, the Baltic states, Poland also, it is important to show that we are good allies and we fulfill our obligations. We have to try to keep ourselves positively in the picture. I mean, taking our defense seriously, the 2% issue, I mean, thankfully our new government is as steadfast on that, and I know also Latvia and Lithuania are fast track on reaching that one. So we can maybe in the business-like worldview of Trump, we can be a kind of a good example for others. But we of course do not know whether he will appreciate it or not. But that's certainly something we will have to do and raise and show us in the positive light for the new administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prax. I think you highlighted a lot of issues that are present here in Latvia as well. So thank you very much for that. And now, last but not least, Finland has also joined us at this NATO table. Welcome, Mr. Mika Aaltola. And one of his most recent publications is Why NATO is Still a More Reliable Partner Than Russia. Could you please expand on that? Thank you. You have about 7 minutes.
Yeah. Sorry that I was a little bit late. We had an event in Helsinki this morning on security of supply. Although what I was told that no other country has a similar type of security of supply focus than Finland has, and it doesn't translate to any other language than Finnish. So there's a lot of that when it comes to Finnish security. And I was thinking about introducing some of the recent conceptualizations in Helsinki when it comes to what is going on. One of the key things in Finland is that we have this concept of realism that is very extreme. Some call it national realism, but I think that's not enough to kind of describe the bleakness of the Finnish realism. So what has happened recently, for example, in Washington and in American presidential elections, perhaps is not that much of a surprise to Finland. The idea has been that we are not reliant on any particular election result. The picture you are seeing there kind of describes much of the Finnish foreign policy. So it's the 1,300 kilometers problem. So how to kind of solve this issue has always been like the key focus of Finnish decision makers. How can the country that is one of the largest ones in Europe be secured without relying in itself, basically? But of course, this conceptualization is not the only one in Finland, and recently the network security model has entered into the Finnish discussions, and I guess the relationship with NATO is about that. You know, capabilities that cannot be, your national capabilities and resources cannot be enough to produce the capabilities needed in order to secure a border like that. So you need to have partners, and the 28+2 solutions that are envisioned in Finland and also in Stockholm basically are based on this idea that further capabilities are needed. So we have moved a bit onwards to describe the two different ideas concerning the Baltic Sea security. And if you see, this is the shipping activity in the Baltic Sea in 1 week. So describes the main sea lines of communications in the Baltic Sea, and Finland is very much reliant on those. The key question is who can secure these main arteries of the Finnish society. The kind of a regular humming of these logistical chains is the key to the Finnish, at least societal security, but also to the military security of supply of Finland. Without the existence of this, you cannot have the other problem, or you cannot solve the other problem. And in there, of course, the big question mark then is what can, for example, NATO or European Union do in order to facilitate this? And if somebody can answer that question, then you are pretty close to answering what President Niinistö was asking in Tallinn last year. Don't ask what we can do for you, but ask what you can do for us. And if there is a kind of a answer to that question, then I'm sure that we can go a little bit further when it comes to this 28+2 solutions. So if we go a little bit further, what has been achieved, you have been following, I'm sure, very keenly on different issues dealing with these major summits and what Finland and Sweden has been trying to achieve through those summits. Gradual integration, gradual understanding of what is the role of non-NATO states in the territorial defense, and what NATO can then kind of contribute backwards. I already referred that Finland is very realistic in its basic assessment of the situation, and then the question becomes to what is kind of there for Finland? What is the key contribution in participation in these common activities and common territorial defense? What can Finland gain through that? And I don't think that there's much of anything else going on in the Finnish decision-making elite in Helsinki. With these visions of kind of the Western window and the gradual disintegration of European Union, or kind of a more selective participation in the NATO Fifth Article responsibilities, is something that is very much on the foreground in Helsinki, and those need to be considered very, very carefully right now when the situation is changing very rapidly. So repulsive realism, I suppose that's the key. It doesn't translate to any kind of a common doctrine in other countries. Repulsive realism, it's something thinking about something that is unheard of. It's very common in Finland. But if you ask a Finn, you know, is there a Russian threat, or what are the scenarios that we should be prepared for? Nobody will publicly say you anything about it, but everybody in private knows what is going on. And that's part of this kind of a national realism or repulsive realism. One of the key aspects of this is that Sweden is the key. Sweden is kind of the security hub from the Finnish perspective. Sweden has been able to form these cross the NATO boundary agreements with Denmark, with Norway, with Poland recently, and it has its solidarity clause with Baltic states. And Finland has been trying to achieve a closer cooperation with Sweden, and kind of a by proxy also being part of other arrangement made by Sweden. So one of the big question marks is, of course, what Sweden is going to do in these times that we are entering in, that are much more uncertain than the times used to be the case. But I suppose that's the time allowed to me, so I will end here and perhaps continue when there's the question and answer session. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aaltola. We will now take a round of questions from audience, if there are any. If you indicate. Mr. Lejiņš is suggesting that his questions were not answered.
I did have those questions, and I think what Mr. Aaltola said about the Finnish-Baltic dilemma, hasn't it been solved? We have now a hard security Baltic Nordic area within a wider NATO framework, but with America as the key player. This, I said earlier, is the dream of the Baltic states beginning from the 1920s, and it's happened. And also, you mentioned, I think you mentioned there also European defense. Would you have some ideas what to do in this situation about the German and French idea of a European army? Do we have to concentrate now a little bit more on the European leg of NATO, or maybe even go further because of the repulsive realism? Thanks for that term.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the audience? There's one here.
Thank you. The issue of hard power has been discussed in depth today, but on the soft power, it would seem to me we have to go back to the old idea that the generals are always fighting the last war, namely what has happened in Ukraine. But there are a lot of soft spots here in the Baltics. I would think if Putin wants to buy influence here, take control of influence, here in the Baltics, there are many ways that he could do that without firing a shot. Maybe you would like to address some of those things about how he could easily just buy influence here, such as strategic business, strategic land, like ports, address some of those issues, which to me seem more likely in terms of Putin's strategy. And there are many talks today, speculations, talks about a grand bargain between the US led by President-elect Trump and Putin. I don't want to go into details of that, it'll take too much time, but maybe I have some ideas on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. We will have the whole second panel dedicated to energy and transport and other soft security issues, but I welcome the panelists to answer their perspectives as well. Are there any other questions in the audience? If not, we will take the first round of answers. I believe the first question was addressed to you, so why don't we start from you, Mr. Atola?
Yeah, well, thank you for a really good question. And of course, it's very difficult to predict the future. But the uncertainties are, of course, the key drivers, and the events are going to also be the key. What happens next? When George Bush came to power, 2000, the agenda he had was a little bit similar to what Trump has been pushing. China-focused foreign policy, America first type of thoughts. But then, of course, September 11th happened, and then everything shifted very suddenly. And I think currently in American administration, there's there's a lot of realists participating in the new administration, but there's also this neoconservative element, strong legacy from the Bush administration is going to be there. So what comes of that? What is the cocktail of American foreign policy? But the geostrategic interests are going to be perhaps wider than the Baltic Sea or the Ukraine case. So the question then becomes: is there any room for some kind of a deal? I don't think that there's any room for a deal. I think NATO is going to be a strong organization also in the future, or a little bit more selective. Who is participating in NATO, and that of course is a big dilemma in Helsinki. So how to think about Finland not having joined NATO before this happened? That's a little bit a catastrophic situation actually currently. So, but as you know, Finland didn't drive down its own national defense. It's rather strong still. The national defense, so there is something to bargain with in Finland. So I'm not hopeless of the situation, but it's going to be very rough ride for the next years, because you don't know what is going to happen in the French elections, in the German elections, and this democratic vulnerability, I think, is the key means that for example, the Russian influence is working in Europe, and we should fix that. That democratic vulnerability, what they did in the American elections, that was masterful. This democratic vulnerability has to be fixed. There's elections coming up also in this neck of the woods, and also in Finland, the presidential elections being like the key to our foreign policy, because the president has the sole responsibility over the foreign policy or the leadership position in that respect. So yes, I'm alarmed of the events that are happening, and there's also a shift from the value-based policy. We have to think, we have to recognize that the Trump administration is strongly anti-Western liberalism. And then, for example, NATO's value talk during the recent years has been focused on solidarity based on values, and it might not be the case anymore in the future. So it's more European NATO, it's more European Union NATO cooperation. But remember that NATO is the strongest transatlantic link, and it is the key to the kind of somehow remaining in contact with the US, which has much broader strategic interest when it comes to China, and trying to also have a reset with Russia, and what happens in that when it comes to those wider, how those wider geostrategic interests resonate into the Baltic Sea region. That's the key.
Thank you very much. Would any other panelists would like to say anything about European security?
Sure, I would add something to the European army notion, because it's very politicized, and I think that in some countries there are still the reverberations of this British perspective of this. First of all, we need to remember that we are not talking about some supranational army with people who has no names and no nationality. It will again, if we are talking about EU capabilities now, we are talking about still national troops that will be deployed for EU purposes in operations. And I will give you my perspective why I think it is a good thing, although maybe still unrealistic, I regret. If we calculate, for example, that to make NATO defenses credible here in the region, and let's say that we know that overall in NATO we have, let's say, 70,000 troops that could be mobilized quickly. This is around a month or 45 days. And we need to have 150,000 troops that can be mobilized quickly. It means that in all those countries in Europe, we need to maintain those troops in higher readiness mode, and it will cost money. And you will also need to have a political will to do it, and you will also need to convince the societies that this is necessary. In some countries, you will just reach the limit what NATO can do, because in some countries there is the perception that, okay, we can invest in different capabilities, but why in NATO? It's not very useful in the south because it has a very bad image there, so we cannot deploy NATO operations to the south. In relation to Russia, it may look confrontational, but there wouldn't be a problem in investing in EU capabilities. At the end of the day, it doesn't make much difference whether we have those troops in high readiness mode, developed in the framework of NATO or in EU. If the crisis appears, they would go under the banner of NATO, probably to the east. If we need to deploy them to the south for crisis management operations, and it needs to be big, we will have a proper pool of forces that can be deployed to the south. This is why I think that politically it is a very, very good idea, and it could push forward, it could encourage countries to invest in those necessary capabilities. EU-NATO cooperation, very briefly. You don't even need to name Russia in the new global EU strategy, but if you see that EU and NATO signed the declaration of the closer cooperation, if you see that there is hybrid scenarios that both organizations should take care of, or that they should focus on defending critical infrastructure. You can also think on the scenario that if there is the crisis in this region, EU will deploy some civilian capabilities, which is pretty good at, civilian capabilities that will take care of critical infrastructure, for example, which will release the national potential, national troops that they won't need to be tied down to take care of the power plant. They can go and do some other more important thing. So this is also why I would like to highlight the importance of this EU-NATO cooperation. Thank you.
Okay, 2 points. First on this European issue, and then also some comment on this hard versus soft tools. I don't want to disagree with you, but just the issue with the major problem in Europe is a total degradation of a lot of important military capabilities, and the major issue which has to be solved is how to build up them again for a situation. Whether a European army is a right tool for that, well, if it would be, I would full-heartedly support it, and theoretically it could be, but in the present situation it's just hard to find it can end in some kind of a bureaucratic infighting thing like that. So a bit skeptical on that, also not I mean, the idea itself is of course nice. Now on this issue of hard versus soft tools in the Baltic context, first I have to disagree with you on what Russia did in Ukraine, basically, because I mean the key for Russia, of course, there are different tools used, but the hard power played a very important or a crucial role in basically, of course, mostly covertly. With Russia denying it, but also, I mean, rather openly in Eastern Ukraine, when the covert tools, or I mean, let's say these unconventional methods didn't work out, Russia still denying it openly intervened militarily in August 2014. So I wouldn't say that the Ukrainian experience has been something which would say that the old traditional military tools are not anymore applicable. Of course, there are other tools, and they are used by Russians in a very concentrated, in a very integrated strategy, but the military power in Russian thinking is very important, and we see it also in Syria and all the other demonstrations. In the Baltic contrast, I think we have been exposed to this something which is in West is called hybrid warfare for quite a long time, and there is a kind of a resilience still inside the societies. I am actually more worried in many ways also about a lot of European societies, and as has been pointed out, I mean, we have the American elections with unprecedented Russian involvement, as said by all the American intelligence agencies through cyber tools, mainly influence operations to influence the outcome of elections. And I'm quite sure we will have the same, for example, in France and certainly in Germany, and also the German intelligence agencies, I think, have already said publicly that they are expecting that, because getting rid of Chancellor Merkel, who, as we know now, has promised to stand for a fourth term, should be a major aim of Russia. And then really this fragile European unity, which has been mainly retained through the efforts of Madame Merkel, might really be gone. Thank you.
Mr. Bernier?
Yes, thank you. Two short remarks. The first one on the question, sir, soft and hard. With the Readiness Action Plan and the notion of having elements from the NATO response force moving around in Europe, we have hit a difficulty linked to logistics. We haven't done logistics related to conventional warfare in Europe for 2 generations. So we lost that ability. I say we collectively, as an organization, as nations. We have privatized a whole series of capabilities. And all of a sudden, we wake up and we say, well, who's the owner of this point of entry? And then the hard questions. So I get your point. A lot of work, I mean, this was an issue that was discussed a couple of times by defense ministers, NATO defense ministers. So there are taskings to the military authorities, to us, to work this out. I mean, one of my colleagues is working on logistics. He's working flat out. All of a sudden, he's very popular. This is a very important issue, and we're tackling it. On NATO EU, we have discovered, we as NATO and the European Union, we've looked at hybrid warfare because it came on our radar screens almost at the same time. And what's interesting is that we put aside the difficulties of who does what, the mandate, the business plan, this, that, the other, and we look into the hard facts. And we started working along different angles, but on key issues that we have to look at from our perspective and from the EU perspective. That's cyber. So for us, it's about the cyber defense of our infrastructure and of some critical infrastructures. And from the EU perspective is that, plus the legal elements and how do we deal with the service providers. Second element, StratCom, public diplomacy, the anti-propaganda thing. How do we look at it open source? How do we deal with it? And knowing that by construction, because we can't just tell lies, we're on the back foot on this one. So it's difficult, but we have to tackle it. Third element, situational awareness. How do we know what's going on? Everything is out there. The half-baked truth and the full lies. So how do we put it together? How do we put the picture and how do we state our case to our own public? Difficult. Fourth element, hybrid warfare, the notion of resilience mentioned. I mean, this is most important. Most of us have forgotten about what resilience is and how do we strengthen our societies. So this is what we're working on.
Thank you very much. We don't really have time for the second round of the questions. So I would like to ask you all a question and then maybe give you a minute or two for concluding remarks. One of our authors, our Russian co-author of the book, Mr. Ivan Timofeyev, has highlighted 5 scenarios, and he suggested that the most likely scenario is essentially sustained containment with security dilemma preserved in the Baltic Sea region after the Warsaw Summit. What is your answer to this? Is this the most likely scenario? And maybe your concluding remarks about this panel. We'll start from Mika Aaltola.
Okay, fair enough. Well, the basic, I think Russia is doing rather well with its hybrid means, information warfare, election hacking. So the need to use other means is now a big question mark. It's doing very well. So the question then becomes for the other, perhaps softer. Soft is a little bit wrong word in this respect. A little bit conniving ways of producing effects on the ground can be used, and I think in the Baltic Sea region, I think one of the key things is this building of different flows. The gas flow, Nord Stream 2 is one such issue that I deal also with the article I wrote. It's similar a little bit to the Chinese ways of building artificial islands. So expanding the kind of the functional space that they control in the Baltic Sea is something that they are very keenly advancing, and it ties into the question that we had before about the ports and the control to or securing the access and the routes in the Baltic Sea. So this expansion of these areas of functional control, I think, is something that we should be very aware of. But the problem with those is that there's also lucrative business deals and kind of a mutual interests there that can buy into the coastal states very easily. And so this geo-economic power that Russia has, but that they have been using very well recently, is something that we should be aware of, and how to kind of counteract that is something that we are very much behind the curve. We have been talking about these things for a couple of years now, but nothing much has been achieved other than the awareness over this. I was very taken back by what happened in the American elections, how soft US itself, the heartland of the kind of the Western liberal world order was. So I don't know how hard we are in here, but we should get very hard very soon.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to give floor to Mr. Praxner.
Okay, well, as I said in my opening remarks, I think kind of a long-term confrontation with Russia is something which you could take for granted. Whether that will develop into something more, let's say, extreme from what it is at the moment, I don't know. Yeah, it might be that this kind of a status quo containment conflict, but below any open, at least military level, is the most likely outcome. But really, I mean, there are different scenarios. I mean, how much time Russia thinks it has, how much money. There are rumors about Putin's health. I mean, you can't be just the rumors. I mean, there are always rumors around. But he certainly might be thinking about what kind of a legacy he's leaving, and thinking what kind of steps he can still take. So you basically have to be ready for all the kind of scenarios, I would certainly say, unfortunately.
Thank you. Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, I think that the most likely scenario is that Russia will continue to raise costs for the West. And it's very important what Mika said, that from the Russian perspective, once there is this clash of ideas from the Cold War disappear, that we had democracies versus communism, and it was a clear division, and the moral higher ground was on the democracy side. Nowadays, Russia perceives liberal democracies as weak, We can see it in many societies that large parts of the societies are disgruntled. They see that the liberal system is unjust and there are too deep divisions, and they want the systems to be reformed. And so Russia also tries to exploit it. And I think that this is what makes me rather think that they will try to exploit it this way rather than go for the hard scenario. But the probability of the military scenario also rise from close to zero to definitely not close to zero. So we cannot be complacent, and we also need to be prepared for this. So this is why we need to invest in those capabilities, and even if it will take years and huge money, so there is NATO defense planning process set off, and we will just need to buy hard stuff.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Mr. Bernier.
Thank you. Very quick elements. First, I have full faith in Western democracy. Second, unity of allies and cohesion is key. 3, sustainable and credible defense policy. And with all this, we will maintain the attractiveness of our open societies. I think that's how we prevail.
Thank you very much. We will conclude this panel now. And could I have a round of applause for our panelists?